Let's talk about travel in RPGs. RPGs can use travel in a really interesting way that no other genre can really manage, and that is they can create distance with travel. That sounds a little strange, so let me explain. Distance is obviously a core part of every narrative, but in most genres, we create distance by explaining that distance exists. So if Indiana Jones needs to go on a jet-setting adventure and fly from New York to China, how do we cover that distance in a way that makes it clear that an enormous amount of distance was covered? Well, we show a cutscene of him getting on a plane, then we show a world map, and there's a dotted line in a plane, and there's a dotted line in a train. Then he gets off, and at the bottom it says, plus 5 days or something, and then some guy speaks Chinese to him, and there's an establishing shot of Beijing. We now understand that Indiana Jones has traveled an immense distance because we've been told that Indiana Jones traveled an immense distance. What didn't happen is we didn't say, hey player, here's a jet, China's kind of that way, good luck. It's not that we couldn't have. You can do that. There's nothing stopping you. But it wouldn't make any sense in, an action-adventure game or something similar. You don't want to interrupt the narrative that matters to tell a story about trying to find your way to China in a jet, because it's not part of that story. But it is part of the story of nearly every RPG. The way that stats work and preparation works in an RPG makes it extremely easy to make travel matter. It's how we explore the world and how the world explores us. All of the choices we've made, all the preparations we've made, are things that now matter because they come up as we're traveling. Being in control of our travels is incredibly important in role-playing games just because of how they're structured. And of course, that means that the narratives also are structured in a similar way. It all flows together. The stats and the narrative cooperate. But how is that different from any other game? Are you saying that if we play Far Cry and we drive around in our Jeep, this is my really great example of how a Jeep looks. If we drive around in a Jeep for 5 minutes, doesn't that create space? We're in control of the Jeep. Aren't we covering distance? And the answer is yes, but there's no abstraction. So if you spend 5 minutes driving between two places in a Jeep in Far Cry, those two places are something like maybe 5 kilometers apart. Because that's how long it takes a Jeep to cover that distance. You are going at a 1-to-1 ratio with the Jeep. That's the actual amount of time the Jeep spent driving at that actual speed. But because of the levels of abstraction that we have in role-playing games, when we see a Jeep travel for 5 minutes in a role-playing game, and we're in control of that, we understand that we're not actually driving along for 5 minutes at 50 kilometers an hour or whatever. No, we're seeing the representation of a traveling Jeep. We're in control of the representation of a traveling Jeep for 5 minutes. That means that we are being told the story of a traveling Jeep for 5 minutes. That's not 5 minutes of travel in the Jeep. That's 5 minutes of being told about the fact that a Jeep is traveling, which is a lot. It's a lot longer. It's days. To make that clear, Fallout 1 and 2 both use a similar thing. I don't think it's Jeeps. I think you actually have some old muscle car. But you travel via world map, and you've got this really abstract representation of the world map, and you crawl across it, this surveyor's map, in a Jeep. And in the corner, there's a timer that ticks by showing you how many days are going by. 1 minute of travel via Jeep in Fallout 1 and 2 is days of in-game time. If we have a city at A and we have a city at B, those are thousands of kilometers apart. And if you get in a couple of encounters on the way, that's to be expected. It's just once or twice a day, right? 5 minutes of travel via a Jeep in Far Cry would be like this far. 1 minute of travel via a Jeep in Fallout is that far, because the abstraction is different. Now, it wouldn't make much sense for Far Cry to adopt this level of abstraction because there's really nothing to say at this level about a Far Cry narrative. You could probably make a Far Cry narrative that does have something to say, But then it sort of becomes an RPG, and you got to do things like, well, are we, equipping our locals well enough to do this or that or whatever? You're turning it into an RPG. But not all levels of abstraction are quite this abstract. In Fallout 3 and 4, they walked this way back, and there's no more world map travel. There is a world map, but you travel on foot all the time, and you can just call it up to see where you are. So you're always jogging everywhere you go at the same level of abstraction. So whether you're fighting an enemy or perusing a store or trying to cross the entirety of Boston, you're traveling at the same abstraction level, which is not very abstract. So 1 minute of travel in Fallout 3 and 4 isn't really very far. It's pretty cramped because there's very little abstraction. This is something that has become a little bit difficult recently because humans are biological. We have base constraints that constrict how long we're willing to hold W, or whatever the travel method is. If we want Link to travel to the far-off Ganon's tower, how far off can that really be? Well, if Link has a world map, it can be a long way off. It can be hundreds of days of travel. It can be months of travel, years of travel, because the world map can have any level of abstraction we want. That's what Link 2 did, Zelda 2 did. It had a world map. But if we're stuck in Link's shoes and we must look at Link traveling one-to-one across the map with no abstraction at all, we obviously can't have it be hundreds of days away because that would mean the player would have to hold W for hundreds of days to get there. So all of space gets compressed, and it keeps compressing, keeps compressing, keeps compressing. We don't want to waste our players' time, so we don't want them to have to actually travel the distances that would make sense. So we use tricks to try and compress the space. We make the buildings smaller and tighter, and we use walls to hide the fact that there are actually, giant monsters on one side of this wall and a bunch of children on the other side of this wall, and as long as you don't cross the wall, you'll never realize that they're 2 feet from each other. But all of these spatial compression methods don't change the fact that we're not traveling very far. We don't hold W for very long, and we're not very abstract about it. We're on foot, and we're only on foot briefly. So the space is very, very small. This is incredibly important. Let me give you an example from Baldur's Gate 3. One of the things that I laughed about in Baldur's Gate 3 is there is this tower full of neutral druids who hate the undead and have the ability to smite them and that sort of stuff. And then there is this tomb full of an ancient lich lord who's not actually evil, but he certainly is undead. And they're about a minute apart. And since, just like with Fallout and the more recent Zeldas, you're literally just walking the whole time, they're a minute of walking apart. And along the way, you'll run into random encounters. Oh, here's a bugbear. Here's some goblins. And it felt so bizarre and hilarious that none of these people ever interacted. The bugbear is literally 10 feet from the goblins. Would you think they would have noticed each other, right? Now, the idea is, of course, that this is supposed to be abstracted. But it isn't abstracted. They forgot to abstract it. You're always on foot. You're always looking at the same map scale. So, to me, the distance between these two fortresses was pretty minimal. Like, what? Maybe 1 kilometer at most. Even though this is the exact same pacing as Fallout 1 and 2. Traveling from a city down to a faraway town on the other side of the map takes about a minute in Fallout 1 and 2. A minute of walking. Obviously, we're not counting the things that aren't walking. You get in a fight, that doesn't count towards your walking total. So, both of these are a minute away, but because the abstraction in Fallout 1 and 2 is so much higher, the distance is bigger. Our allergy to showing a map and letting the player travel via some abstracted method is really making our worlds feel ever more cramped, and I'm not a big fan of that. But it also has some other constraints, some problems involving things like how do our stats entangle with the encounters that we find along the way? How do we do things like supplies? If travel is an important part of our game, but everything is less than 3 minutes of walking away, then how do we make it so that you have to get ready to travel? How feasible is it to have, for example, opposing armies that are so close to each other that the player can cover that distance in 2 minutes? Space gets tighter and tighter and tighter and tighter and tighter. And of course, we get instant travel, auto travel, teleporting, which makes the space even smaller and tighter and smaller. All of that space gets collapsed. We're not creating any distance with our actual travel. We do create distance via other means, like we did with Indiana Jones, but not via travel. This means that our narratives are starting to suffer, because if we have city A and we have city B, and we want these two cities to be really far apart, well, then we have the player travel. How far the player can travel is dependent mostly on the level of abstraction, not on how much time they actually spend holding forward. Because humans have a specific range of time they're willing to spend holding forward. So if you hold forward for maybe 5 minutes to get from A to B, that's maybe an hour of gameplay. Because you got like 55 minutes of battles and side quests and whatever else, right? But this hour of gameplay isn't part of our holding forward. So going from A to B without any interruptions, just holding forward, 5 minutes. That is like pretty much the upper maximum of what someone playing an RPG is willing to put up with. Some games are built a little bit different. For example, Elite Dangerous, you can hold up for, 3 or 4 days, like actual in-world days. But that's because the expectation there is that you're going to be playing other games and doing other stuff and have Elite Dangerous running in the background. But in this case, the amount of time a player can concentrate on just holding forward, I would say it's not likely to be more than 5 minutes. So rather than trying to make A and B further apart by making them take more physical player time, you just change how large the abstraction is. A good example of this would be the early Final Fantasies. You start in Corneria and you're on foot, but it's already an abstracted on foot. Yeah, you're seeing the same sprites walking, but the map is clearly at a different scale. So you're clearly seeing a map of the characters rather than the characters walking around. So you understand that time is passing much, much faster on the world map than it would be in the town. Because the town was just that one little tile. And you're crossing one of those tiles every time you hit left. So you walk from Corneria over to that place where all the pirates live, and that takes maybe 5 minutes, 10, 15 minutes with random encounters. And that is a long journey. That is an epic journey where you struggle to maintain your health as you are beset by endless enemies, the likes of which you've never seen. You turn back at one point because you ran out of spells, and you have to rest and set out again. It's epic. 5 minutes of holding W, or in this case it would be D, because you're traveling east. But it's epic because of the scales involved, because of the balance of the stats, because of the kinds of encounters you face and the numbers involved. Then you get to the place with all the pirates and you steal their boat. And you set off on your boat. And you make this exact same journey in like 30 seconds. And you understand that you have just seen a massive breakthrough. You can now move so much further, so much faster. So now, if you use this boat to travel for 5 minutes, you understand that that is a huge distance. You've covered an enormous distance because a boat is a much more fast and abstract method of travel than someone walking around. And then later on, you get an airship. And the same thing happens. You understand that the airship travels even faster than the boat. So you understand that if you spend 5 minutes traveling on an airship, you're probably going to the friggin' moon or some other place that's equally far away because it's an unimaginable distance, even though it's the same length of time. So when you're writing a narrative, you have to understand how you're going to create a sense of distance that's appropriate for the story you're telling. If you need the player to travel an immense distance, you don't do it by having them hold W for an immense length of time. You do it by changing up the kind of abstraction they're seeing as they travel, but they retain control. Because that's an important part, how you respond to travel. Travel is how you explore the world and how the world explores you. So it's an important thing for you to maintain control and get a chance to see how your stats and your choices conflict and contrast with what the world expects and what it does. You don't always have to give the player a new method of locomotion to change the abstraction. A good example of that would be if the player buys a ticket onto an airship, then the airship can fly for 30 seconds or whatever, and then you can have some kind of player thing happen. They can explore the airship for a bit, and then the airship continues to travel for another 30 or 40 seconds. So you have these beats where the airship travels and the player sees that the airship is traveling, but it's done in more of a hands-off way, like how it would happen in Indiana Jones with a map and a dotted line, that sort of thing where it's not interactive directly. But the player is still given control during their trip intermittently. Not of the vehicle of travel, but at least enough to see that there is a new place. They've reached some place far from where they were. They're traveling and they're now over the oceans or whatever. So they get some kind of feedback. Even though it's not directly from controlling the travel, they still understand that the travel is happening and distance is being created. And all of this contrasts really interestingly with things like combat. And things like, oh, there's a dungeon over there. Are you going to go inside? Or things like, oh, yeah, you just traveled all across space and time. You've gone from A to B, and it took you 10 minutes of travel via an airship that can travel through time. So yes, A is like caveman time, and B is like super future magic tower time. But the way we've written it in a modern RPG, someone in B will be like, oh, hey, can you take this letter back to A for me? And you'll use quick travel to instantly travel back to A, and that means, congratulations, A and B are now right next to each other. All of that spatial compression that we've come to know in a modern game has led to a lot of networks of interactions, narrative beats, that end up really looking like they're twisted and complicated, connecting every node to every other node. You're constantly flung back and forth across the map because that's how you create play, right? You create play by having the player constantly go back and forth across the map, right? Oh yeah, and everybody audio travels everywhere, so it's all just busy work that compresses the map down into nothing. And now you might be thinking, well, hold on. If it takes literally 10 minutes of holding forward to get from A to B, because it's a long way, and that's not including things like side content and monster fights, having them travel back and forth multiple times constantly to do side quests would be awful. Can you imagine that? Having to actually hold W for 10 minutes to do a side quest? And the answer to that is, you're the one that's in control of the side quests. Why are you making it unimportant about the distance between A and B? If you want A and B to feel far apart, don't connect them with random little side quests that are expected to be trivial. So instead of having a network that looks like a ball of twine, you have a network that radiates out from spokes, which is, a familiar concept to anybody that's ever seen actual network topologies and stuff, right? And in this way, each of these locations feels very distinct and has their own clusters of content. And there's very little that repeats back along its path, right? You see this a lot in linear RPGs. You'll go from the starting village to the Elven City, and you'll probably never go back to the starting village, or if you do, it's going to be after such a long distance, such a long period of time, that the starting village is now completely different. Someone burned it down. This idea that we create a lot of distance by traveling is great, but it does mean that that distance has to be respected. We can't just willy-nilly let the player cross it for trivial reasons, because that means that the distance doesn't exist anymore. Is this my screed against fast travel? Well, sort of. I'm not against doing things fast, but if you want to do things fast, what you should do is use another abstraction layer. if you want to make A and B really, really far apart and take 10 minutes to get to, because it's a major 10 minutes of folding forward, which is like an hour of actual time. And it's a major thing. Oh, it's a big difference. The player has set out from home. They're traveling to the elven village. It's going to take them an hour to get there. It is an epic journey for them to set out on at this phase in the game. But I do want them to connect back and forth all the time. I need them to have a whole bunch of little side quests that connect these two places because they're not as distinct as you might think. And that's fine. Give them an eagle. Now they can cover it via eagle in like 30 seconds. Give them a new kind of expedition map where they can just say, oh yeah, I'm buying 8 units of food and hiring a porter, and, you know, map comes up, ding, 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 done. So yes, I am against fast travel in terms of teleporting without changing any sort of abstraction layer. But you can travel fast. Just change the abstraction level so it makes sense for what you need. Well, I could keep talking forever, but I think that's more than enough. See you around.